The Scottish Green Party is meeting in Edinburgh this weekend. The party already has 2 MSPs and says it hopes to build on this base in the Scottish Parliament elections next year. Later, they'll hear from Caroline Lucas, who was elected to Westminster as the party's first MP in this year's general election. And Caroline Lucas joins me live now from Edinburgh. Welcome to BBC News. Thank you very much for joining us. You're going to be talking, I believe, about alternatives to the cuts that the coalition government is imposing. Why do you think that the cuts they're suggesting are so wrong?
Because it's quite clear that these cuts are going to hurt the poorest hardest. They're going to hit women and children. They're going to decimate public services. So they're going to have a massively negative social effect. But crucially, they're also utterly economically illiterate. It's precisely at a time of economic difficulty that we need to be investing in jobs, not cutting 500,000 public sector jobs and then crossing our fingers just hoping that the private sector will take that slack up, because it's far more likely that the loss of public sector jobs will have a knock-on effect, losing private sector jobs too. We could be losing 1 million jobs. But so what we're saying is that we need to have real investment in jobs now. That's the way to get people's tax revenues into the economy. That's the way to get the economy moving again. But
the government would argue that they're looking at a record deficit that they inherited from the Labour government, and this is the only way to tackle it. And they would also argue that their taxation system is going to be more progressive. They're taking thousands of people out of income tax completely, and that they're expecting the rich to pay a greater proportion towards this deficit than the poor.
Well, first of all, yes, we need to tackle the deficit, but the idea that you do it by throwing 1 million people out of work is just simply not the case. History shows that that's just more likely to trigger us into a double-dip recession. So yes, we have to tackle the deficit, but not by destroying jobs. And yes, the government will say that it's being progressive by bringing some of the poorest out of taxation. But if you look at the overall impact of the whole cuts programme, actually the poorest are going to be hit hardest. Yes, they'll say that they're going to introduce a banker's levy, but look at the real impact of that. Because they're reducing corporation tax at the same time, the impact on the bankers will be far, far less. So these cuts are deeply unfair, but they're also unnecessary. If we had a government with the political will, for example, to track down the 40 billion a year minimum that is lost through tax evasion, tax avoidance, if they would introduce things like the Robin Hood tax that would raise another £20 billion, that's money that could be invested in jobs. That's a much better way of getting the deficit down, rather than risking the kinds of unrest and damage that's been done in countries like Ireland. We have an opportunity here not to go down that road, and that's what I'm going to be talking to the Scottish Green Party about today.
I must ask you finally, and very briefly, if you would, what do you make of Iain Duncan Smith's idea of getting the long-term unemployed into work, hopefully, via this idea of a 4-week placement, possibly doing manual labour?
Well, what I dislike about it is that same sense of punishment which is coming out of this coalition government. Of course, there are many people who would be delighted to take a work placement, but the way in which it's being presented is that it's your fault if you don't have a job. If you don't have a job, you're going to be losing your housing benefit, 10% of your housing benefit after a year as a result of this government's plans. And this whole programme is being introduced in a way that yet again smacks of punishment. It smacks of the idea that there are millions of people out there who are lazing around, just choosing not to have a job. My experience of talking to people in my constituency is that they are desperate for the jobs, but the jobs aren't there. The government's just about to cut what will end up being at least 1 million more. What we need to do is to be supporting people into jobs, not punishing them.
Caroline Lucas, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Let's take a look at the sports news now.